its birth outside. It was only out of Soviet Russia's immense and heroic struggle against Germany that democratic nations gained a true concept, vast and capability of this nation, destined to emerge at war's end as the youngest, largest of those three dominant powers. Part of this vast nation is its capital, Moscow. In the war, Moscow marked the eastward limits of the German invasion. Even through weeks in which the enemy was being turned back at its very gates, Moscow continued to function calmly and efficiently, though many government bureaus were moved farther east, including the Foreign Office. Nevertheless, Vyacheslav Molotov, Commissar of Foreign Affairs, continued to conduct much of his business from the capital. Marshal Stalin, refusing to move from the Kremlin, carried on affairs of state while simultaneously acting as commander-in-chief of Russia's armed forces.
Житомира, Одессы. Уже летом этого года немецко-фашистская армия.
As the battle receded from the city, Moscow, almost undamaged, resumed its wartime routine. At places like the Café National, Soviet heroes who had won government awards for their valor at the front could sometimes celebrate by dining in practically pre-war style. From Moscow was directed the operation of Russia's complex of railroads. The efficiency with which huge forces were moved at need from place to place over these lines was a revelation to those on the outside who had predicted that Russia's transportation system would prove totally inadequate to the wartime needs of so vast a country. For Soviet Russia, almost 3 times as big as the United States, comprises 1/6 of all the land in all the world, and the western battle line it held was, at its greatest, nearly 2,000 miles long. Northern bastion of this line was Leningrad, the former Tsarist capital, which stood steadfast through more than 2 heroic years against the Germans smashing at its gates, afraid to die for the land they loved. On the Amur River, 4,400 miles from Sevastopol, half again as far as from New York to San Francisco, gunboat squadrons patrol the waters which separate Russian Siberia from Japanese-held Manchuria. To help bolster the nation's food supply, the Soviet fishing fleet in the Pacific off Kamchatka was partially manned by women throughout the war. In remote Kazakhstan and in the Caucasus, tilling the soil was looked upon as war service by the farmers and herdsmen who knew that the fight for food was a fight for victory. With every mile of the German advance, farmers were forced to work harder than ever to make up for the loss of rich lands occupied by the enemy. On hundreds of thousands of farms, from European Russia to the Pacific shores of Siberia, men and women worked from dawn to dusk to increase production. On the remotest Abkhazian tea plantations, workers felt and responded to the pressure of war. From every corner of the immense land, the harvest of all Russia's farmers were directed into a single stream to sustain the nation and nourish its fighting men. Baku and other great centers of Russian oil production steadily increased their vital output, even with the enemy threatening at times to overrun them. The Soviet Union officially recognized those workers who, by skill, initiative, and hard labor, beat production quotas. Honored like military heroes were such men as driller Stepanov in shaft number 20 of the Karaganda mine, who exceeded his quota by 500%. In Russia's industrial offensive, women played an equal part with men in mine and mill and factory. It was the vast new industrial area Russia had had the foresight to build up in peacetime in the Urals, 1,000 miles within the interior, which gave the Soviet Union the productive capacity which enabled it to survive. For when the industrial cities of the Ukraine and the Donetsk Basin had fallen to the enemy, Magnitogorsk and other new centers in the Urals still continued to pound out weapons. And to these were added whole factories, removed from the path of the advancing Germans and set up beyond their reach. The front needs it, we will do it, was the fighting slogan of Soviet workers for every day of war. Each worker felt deeply and personally that this was his war, that he and his fellow workers had a vested interest in their shop and their jobs, and that with these went the responsibility for maintaining and increasing the total output of weapons with which to kill the hated enemy. Through the long months of peril, it was as unthinkable for a workman to desert his bench as for a soldier to leave his post. After their working day was over, millions of Russians put in more hours, learning the tactics of hand-to-hand fighting, so that they could serve usefully either in the army or as guerrillas. Wherever the Germans advanced, they had to contend with Russia's organized partisans, who struck at the enemy behind his own lines. Supporting these guerrillas were the nearby villagers, who, when weapons were lacking, improvised them out of whatever was at hand. Again and again, bands of partisans would appear out of nowhere, wiping out enemy detachments and freeing village after village. After the enemy was driven out, the villagers and partisans dealt with traitors. Between Russia's civilians and fighting men, there was little distinction. Each had his job to do in the war effort, whether he was a combat flyer or a Soviet artist assigned to entertain the troops. After year, Soviet flyers smashed away at the German Luftwaffe, then reputed to be the most powerful air force in the world. Slowly, they whittled it down and helped destroy the myth of German invincibility. Russia's forces, both on the ground and in the air, had to prove their worth to a world that had been profoundly skeptical. In the face of pre-war predictions that the Russians could not hold out more than a few weeks against the Germans, Soviet fighting men took the worst punishment the enemy could mete out and survived. For months, Russia fought desperately on the defensive, yielding where it must, holding where it could. Then began the series of mighty counteroffensives which amazed the world and started Germany's downfall. Soviet fighting men proved themselves masters of deceptive warfare, of the ambush and the surprise attack. Wherever Russian soldiers went, with them went Soviet nurses, who saved countless thousands of wounded men. Gathering momentum, the Soviet counterattack soon became all-out offensives, driving the Germans back in full retreat. Again and again, Russian tanks drove ahead against Nazi anti-tank guns, firing at point-blank range. For the Germans, who had once dreamed of conquering and ruling all the world, the end had begun. But before they were finally driven from Russian soil, millions of them were to die violently and terribly. Whole armies which never lived to march against British Tommies or American doughboys. For the defense of their homeland, the Russian people paid in suffering and sacrifice on a scale almost beyond human conception. More than 12 million Russians, soldiers and civilians, were killed. Some 10 million others were wounded or found to be missing. And those Russians who gave their lives died not for Russia alone, but for mankind as well. Thus passed year after year of Russia's terrible ordeal, an ordeal which revealed not weakness, but strength, increasing from day to day. Its unity and its power, untested at war's beginning, were daily proved by a tenacious people unwavering in their love for their homeland and their determination that no foreigner should possess it. And by late 1944, when the last of Hitler's hordes had been driven from Russian soil, the Soviet Union had emerged as one of the three mightiest nations of the earth, a world power to be reckoned with in war or in peace. At war's end, proud of their share in the victory over Germany, proud of their new position as citizens of one of the world's great powers, the people of Russia faced with confidence a new test, the test of whether their nation and the other world powers could work together in peace as they had in war, to preserve for all peoples that for which the war had been fought, freedom and security and mutual well-being.